Around, I'll pause a little bit more and actually get some participation there. I asked for it last time, but I didn't really give the time for it during the class. So with that, again, just got a series here looking over the genealogy of David. Very, very important bloodline and a very important history and action provided through this bloodline, through the Bible, as we see. We touched last week looking at Ruth, and which brings in Moab, which was an interesting learning. If we see early on again in the Bible, God has actually forbid a Moabite from entering the assembly of God. So it's kind of interesting to see the Davidic line then come into that. It was supposed to be forbidden or until the 10th generation. So how you want to look at that, I kind of at times when I see that, basically it's a, it's a no-go from that point forward with God saying to the 10th generation. But we see that not to be the case. And again, as we are well aware of, we don't question God, right? Where we may say, hey, he said one thing, right? May seem, if you will, the word contradiction may exist. Again, we're not there to question God, though. So we've seen Ruth, and then Boaz became her spouse. He was an individual that was a kinsman. As Ruth came back over into Israel, into Bethlehem with the Israelites following Naomi, Boaz took on the responsibility of Ruth's bringing her genealogy up in and all the property and responsibilities that her husband had left behind through Elimelech. With today, we'll go into Obed. So as we see there, to begin with, kind of flopped a little bit, but his parents were Ruth and Boaz. This one won't take us too long. It's kind of an interesting thing here as we look at the genealogy. We have pretty good details on most of the people in that, but Obed himself, there is just scarce details in the Bible. He's only mentioned in those 2 verses there provided in Ruth. His name there is servant of God, though. With that, with the very bottom one, it's just understood for him to be a godly individual. We couldn't tell you, again, any details about his life. Even historians have looked back, trying to identify him. And again, it's just scarce of what we have. We have his name in the Bible, and then Ruth and Chronicles providing us, his lineage there in documentation. He was the grandfather to David. We don't know who Obed's wife was, to the point of, again, we don't have the details. Assumption is that he was about 1200 BC. So again, very, very long time ago. Interesting, and again, to know that these individuals existed as we read the Bible, right? These names are real people. And his child was Jesse, which again is a very significant figure, and we'll dive into here next. Obed is also, again, just in the genealogy in Matthew and Luke. Those will go back through and give the Davidic line there in relation to Jesus Christ. So again, that's the only places you can actually observe his name. Jumping over to his son Jesse, we'll go over to 1 Chronicles there and read a little bit of an introduction on Jesse. And we'll start in verse 13 there. Jesse became the father of Eliab, his firstborn, Adinadab the second, Shemiah the third, Nathaniel the fourth, Radai the fifth, Ozem the sixth, David the seventh, and their sisters were Zuriah and Abigail. The sons of Zuriah, Abishai, Joab, and Ashel, 3. So here we have just the list of Jesse's children. He had a total of 8 sons, 2 daughters. Kind of interesting to note, he was almost 100 years old there when he bore David. So again, something very different from what we see in today's, right? We typically, at 100 years, life has ceased. But the significance of the Davidic line and David, again, I think this shows kind of not a miracle happening, but again, we see an intervention from God. We've also seen this with John the Baptist. You see it also with Abraham. Sarah was very old, so initially she gave her concubine, Hagar, to have the child of Ishmael, and then God blessed her. So I would assume something similar going on with this line here. We're not told those details, but it looks very much similar to those. So again, just the significance of, we see the Abrahamic line, John the Baptist, David, very, very prominent, significant figures in Judaism and Christianity's historical timeline. Jesse, the name, means king, but very interesting again when we look in the Hebrew language. It's not similar to our language. They didn't have vowels. So the name Jesse and Jesus is actually pronounced the same. They would have sounded the same. It would have been Esau. So again, just kind of cool there. They are spelt different, but it's our translation that makes those different. So I think it's very important again that, right, ideally we are reunited with these individuals at some point in time. You know, you would ideally would want to call him Esau if you've seen this individual. His parents there, Ruth and Boaz, we looked at last week. So Jesse has got some Moabite genealogy in him again, right? That's going to pass down through this Davidic line. So that's an answer I can't answer for you again, but it is an area of interest and just a side study I'm doing there to try to identify that, because again in Deuteronomy you see a very bold statement from God. So. And then Jesse's timeline there, about 1150 BC. So again, we're going in about 50 to 100 year increments with these individuals stepping down through this timeline. The 8 sons and the 2 daughters, very important again, with David being the youngest of those sons. We see when Samuel comes, and we'll dive into that a little bit here, looking for the next successor to Saul. He comes into Jesse, which is going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 17 there. What we see there is God telling the prophet Samuel that he is going to go find the next anointed one, and God's going to point this individual out to him and identify him, and that is going to be the successor to Saul. Unfortunately, Saul had fallen away from God, and his spirit, God's spirit, had been removed from Saul, so he was on his demise. And again, God was identifying who was going to be the successor to him. Is anybody here familiar with Saul and kind of his fall away? Okay, we'll first step, we've got a couple verses called out here. Actually they're not, they'll be on the next, on the Davidic line, so we'll step into it there. But we'll see initially for where Saul came into the place of the Bible, why he even entered into kingship, etc. But again, stepping back, on 16:17, Samuel is a prophet of God. Saul is king at that time, but again, he has lost favor with God. God has told Samuel, you're going to go forth, and I want you to go ahead and anoint the next king. Samuel's very scared at this point in time, right? Because Saul is king, and he knows with this going forward, him anointing anybody else likely gets his head cut off of him. So he asks God for some help. God says, go and act like you're going to give a sacrifice here and invite Jesse and his family to participate in this sacrifice. So he's going to help kind of hide it from Saul. So Saul knows the activities are going on. Samuel comes in and he starts to look, and he's listening for God to tell him which one of these individuals. So he's looking at Jesse's sons, his bloodline, these 8 individuals. And he's listening to God, again, for the key to say, that's the next one, that's the anointed one. While they're going through that ceremony, David is actually absent. He's out actually attending to the sheep out in the field. So Samuel gets to observe 7 of the sons of Jesse, and God never speaks to him during this period, never points out saying, that's the one I want you to anoint. So he's a little confused, and he asks Jesse, is this all of your sons? And Jesse says, no, I've still got one out. The youngest is out tending to the sheep. So Samuel tells us, go ahead and call him, right? We're going to wait here until he comes here, and then we'll go ahead with the sacrifice and proceed forward. So David comes in, and God goes ahead and speaks to Samuel, right? That's the one, right? That's the anointed one. Go ahead and anoint him. So Samuel at that time goes ahead and anoints David, right? He's still just a young lad. So that point forward, obviously David was already a man of God's heart. Did I say that right this time? Last time I got that backwards. So, yeah, he's a man of God's heart. And now it's confirmed. God is already saying, I am going to use this man as well, right? David was just coming up as a boy, had a love and a zest for God that we don't see in a lot of individuals, just inherently. And then God again confirms it with this anointment. And then things start to proceed forward. So we know that David has been identified. Jesse is aware of it. Samuel's aware of it. And then, we'll step into and kind of watch things take forward. The second call out there in 1 Samuel 22, 3 through 4, kind of interesting, just back to the Moabite scenario, is with David being anointed now, the next king. Saul is still currently there, but Saul is seeking vengeance on David. So we've called out several times that Saul, initially David was favored in Saul's eyes, but then it became where the Spirit of God left Saul, and now Saul is out seeking to kill David. So David is actually running from Saul for a period of time for his life. Saul is literally seeking to kill David and his family. So this here, David actually goes and asks the Moabite king for his father, Jesse, and his mother to go ahead and seek refuge there with them. So Jesse and them go ahead and hang back in Moab there, which again is interesting because God has forbidden the Moabites. These are not a favored people with God, but again they are leveraged back to helping preserve and save the Davidic line here. Another specific call out here with Jesse, just over in Isaiah. So if we turn there real quick. Can I get you to read that, Greg? Would you mind reading that?
All right. Isaiah 11:1-2.
Yep.
And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge, and the Spirit of the Lord.
So again, just the importance, the stump of Jesse. As we look at Isaiah, I think you guys studied that, or the women did their study across that. Jeanette, I believe, was helping lead that. But obviously, again, another very, very important book in the Bible of Isaiah. Provides, a lot of good information. At times it can be difficult to understand, if you will. But, some things are pretty point blank here. And as we look at here, right, it's called out, right, there's greatness that is going to be had here. And it's coming out of, depending on your translation, it's going to say stump, stock of Jesse, etc., etc. And again, as we get into David and going forward, these earlier people, again, we're just kind of showing the birth here. We don't get a whole lot of understanding of what their actual actions were, other than giving birth into David. And then forward, we see a lot from David and his children as far as what they do for God here. So let's jump over here into David. His name is going to be the Beloved One. I don't think anybody would contest that. We get a lot of input, a lot of information from David, one of the more documented individuals we have in the Bible, both from a third party or historical perspective, and then obviously the Psalms of David. His father is Jesse. Another surprise, his mother we don't know. I searched through and through the Bible. If anybody could find her name, obviously please do bring it to my attention, but I could not find her name anywhere. So that one wasn't unexpected, but when you look back at the way the tradition worked through the recording of genealogy, it always was up through the male line. So we do lose track of a lot of females, unfortunately, throughout it. But again, I thought his mother would be a known in the Bible. David's roughly born about 1055 BC. So again, his father was 100 years old roughly when he had him. There's give or take on that, if you will, but for a rough understanding. So just again, kind of not a miracle birth, if you will, but there was definitely something prominent, significant going on there, because Jesse already had 7 other sons that could have sufficed. Samuel actually thought the first son that was presented was the oldest, kind of the biggest, the strongest, the most handsome, was going to be the one, but ended up being the last one to come in. David, as we're well aware of, had multiple wives. We actually get them listed there if you go back into 1 Chronicles. And then, we're also made mention where he had many concubines as well. You can delve into that as much as you prefer. Children are going to be the important part here, right? This is the Davidic line, again, from David forward. There's been a covenant made that his bloodline is going to hold the kingship of Judah. This is what Jews still look forward to today, right? They expect the Messiah is coming from this bloodline and is going to lead them into victory. Nice thing is, again, we'll go through each one of those children as we go here step by step, and we can understand who was with God and actually even see some waywardness. We'll see some of that in David's life himself. The became king line here, just have a little discussion there and kind of see, I've got 2 different dates listed there. So first question, and I don't open to the audience here, when we look at the kingship of the Israelites, what number of king was David? Where did he fall? We've got our presidents, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. Does anybody know what King David was? What number? Number 2? Anybody else?
That would sound right, because Saul was first.
Saul was first, yep.
And he succeeded.
Okay. He's actually number 3. Yep. If we read back through there, reason I've got 2 dates, Saul died, natural succession was through the bloodline. So that would have been Saul's son, Ishbosheth. And he was recognized at first. So when Saul parted, him and Jonathan both died together, if you will. They took Saul and buried him. So yep, Ishbosheth became king. There was a parting of ways that happened. So initially Ishbosheth becomes the 2nd king. There's a splitting between north and south in the country that happens. David becomes king of the south in 1010. Ishbosheth owns the north. He's got south in 1010. So Ishbosheth was actually king for, I think it was almost 50 years. Might have been 30. And then Ishbosheth ends up dying, and everybody recognizes David as king of north and south. So there was actually a split. So he's actually the 3rd in line there. So it was a learning for myself as well that Ishbosheth was in there. So kind of, again, just a fun takeaway. But so David initially become king. He was anointed by God, but that didn't mean the Israelites accepted that, right? There's God and then there's mankind. So there was a conflict that happened there. And there was some war that took place, some battles and stuff. So David was even still running for his life at 1010, because the supporters of Ishbosheth were still after him, trying to kill him and go ahead then, if they could, go ahead and reabsorb the southern Israelites back into them. But God's plan didn't play out that way. So if we go to 1 Samuel again, and we'll kind of step into the kingship because I think it's very important. We see the books of Judges and Kings, but it's important to understand that those were, and we'll see here, things that man asked for. God did not initially have this hierarchy for man designed. So where are we at there? It's 1 Samuel 8:19. Jerry, would you mind reading that one?
First Samuel 8:19?
Yep.
But the people would not listen to Samuel. They said, "No, we want you a king to rule over us."
So here, mankind actually asked for a king, and this is where Saul came into the picture. Prior to that, the Israelites tried it through judges. So again, as you read the book of Judges, it is actually that, as we see in a court of law, a judge, a governing body that man asked for. That didn't work out so well. So then mankind asked for a king. We want a king, and that's what we're hearing, or Jerry just read to us. So with that, Saul was the first appointed king through God. He found favor, then lost favor with God. His son took over. And David, there was a splitting, took over, and then David is going to find king. So then a little bit farther there, 1 Samuel 15:10. So man has asked for kings. God said, I'll give you a king. That was Saul. And then we'll see 15:10 there. The word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So again there we see the kingship already going south with God, with the very first king, and to the point of where God's spirit is removed from Saul and his demise comes. He dies on the battlefield. His body's taken from the battlefield and kind of thrown down to where people can walk by and curse him. Wasn't a glorious burial like you would hope as a king. And then First Chronicles there, you will see something obviously very common here. You're going to see Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Samuel's, 1st and 2nd Kings. Those are going to be the books, right, to get most of the details of David's life. And obviously Kings is relative to the kingship of Israel. 1 Samuel 16, 12, 13, not shortly after, right, Saul losing the favor of God there. He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, rise and anoint him, for this is the one. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. So again, very important here, right? God actually identified David. Saul was there as well, so there is potential again. It's kind of interesting and makes me wonder what would be going through God's mind right now, right? He's seen the judges, that hierarchy didn't play out. Man asked for it. Now man's asking for a king. The first king of Saul didn't play out in his favor. Initially started there, but it didn't continue. And then obviously with the Davidic covenant, that's where we're discussing, and we'll really look through the kinship of David himself specifically. Going through this Davidic covenant, which we'll read here so that we understand what that is. 7:12. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, so when David dies, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. So again, that's the Davidic covenant, which is a very important thing. Judaism is built on that, right? As we look today, and that's what the battle over Hamas, Israel, today is. They're still expecting. They don't recognize Jesus Christ. That's the split between Christianity, Judaism. With that, they expect a physical person to come into power and going to lead them victory over Hamas, Israel, if you will, global power. And they're sitting on this covenant, which is from God. I would say we can't argue with it, right? What it looks like in today's world is interesting. Hence, I kind of like to study this to understand. The Jews were, they're working off documentation from God saying, right, the Davidic line here is going to bring fruition into the Israelites. But then we've seen a new covenant come along the way as well, right? So how does all this pan out? And again, that'll be God's plan. Don't say right, wrong, indifferent. But it's important, I think, that we study and we give respect and understanding to this. As we'll see with David, we'll dive a little bit deeper here as well next week. But some of the actions that he took, because David wasn't always a godly man. I think it's important as we look at ourselves, me especially, trying to set a standard and an understanding of how to be a godly individual. There is no perfection in us today. Unfortunately, we can really strive and go for that depending on mindset. But it is kind of a recipe for failure at times. So it's a good grounding to go back through. And David, again, with the details that were provided, David did some interesting things both on the positive side and the negative. Last sermon I gave, we got to see where David actually spared Saul's life. Again, David's running from Saul, willing to relocate his mother and father into Moab to protect them, and he's going to stay on the run ahead of Saul. But he never, ever, talks bad about Saul. He has potential. Multiple times he could actually killed Saul. He could have alleviated any risk, any threat to himself, and he could have jumped on into the kingship. He already knew he was anointed from a young lad. I mean, God's prophet came to him and actually put the oil on him and did the full anointing. So he knew he was in God's favor all along. So to hold steadfast like he did in those times, very interesting. And then, later on as he steps into the kingship, which we'll get into Bathsheba there and stuff and look at that in more detail. It's an interesting choice where he makes there, just given the history that David had. Again, I think it shows man can trip up. All of us are man, if you will. Any questions, call-outs on David or Jesse there?
Ishbosheth was 40 when he became king and was dead by 103.
Okay, 3 years in is what it was? Okay, not 30 or 50, so.
2 years, but he was dead before he carried.
Okay, yep.
And I guess in God, the soldier thrust through several when he was one of them.
And I may have not put that. That might be the First Chronicles. We didn't read that. So to your point there, Greg, let me get that verse.
That was where I got that was 2 Samuel 10 through 15.
Read.
Second Samuel 2:10. Sorry.
Okay, and then, the Chronicles 1. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness. He was unfaithful to the Lord, in that he did not keep the command of the Lord. Moreover, he had consulted a medium seeking guidance, and did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, son of Jesse. So back to the point of, God had made the determination that Saul's lineage wasn't going to last, and as Greg calls out, 3 years there, so I apologize for the 30 to 50. So it was a 3-year problem, or a 3-year stint, and God went ahead and made that an extinct issue.
Saul's death, was that the one where the soldier that killed him come bragging to David, and David, I think, killed him on the spot?
You're correct. Saul had got injured in battle. God told him not to go. They went ahead and went. He got injured. That servant come up. Saul asked him to go ahead and kill him. So he went ahead and did that. And then he reported back to David. And David said, "You fool, right? How are you going to kill a man of God?" And so he killed him. Yep. And back to the point, right, of David, killed the man that killed Saul when Saul was already dying, right? He basically took him out of misery, right? It would have actually been a very respectful, dignified thing to do in battle back then. And David still said, "You're a fool," and killed him. So up to the very, very, very end, David really, again, never did cross Saul, never even thought of crossing Saul, and held Saul to the utmost. Very, very interesting. Any other comments, call-outs? And Ishbosheth, does it call out he was in the north? Does it say Ishbosheth was of the north in those verses you were looking at? Make sure I got that right.
He reigned 2 years. Only the house of See, he reigned 2 years over Israel. Only the house of Judah followed David. Let's see. David was the king of Hebron over the house of Judah for 7 years. And this says, in verse 10 says he was over, I keep finding it says north. It says he was over Israel, but the house of Judah followed David.
Okay. So I was probably getting onto a map there when I was looking at the timelines and stuff of the regions they were over. Obviously a lot of battles through these books and this timeline going on the entire time.
Back to verse 9, 8 and 9. Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all of Israel. So, I guess maybe to your point, maybe that is the Lord, I don't know. But the house of Judah followed David.
Just, yep, tribe of Judah.
In First Chronicles 2, 13 through 16, it gives Jesse's children, and of course it just says the 7 sons and the 2 daughters. How come it just mentions them, and then when you go to Chronicles, it's got the 8 sons that come?
Yeah, you'll see a little discrepancy there, guys. So yeah, and you'll see that.
It doesn't matter, obviously, but it's just
Yep.
wow, one book says it's 7.
Yep. And you'll see even some discrepancy in numbers again when you're looking at Chronicles, Samuel's, Kings. So there are some similar stories or the same stories, but again, some of the details there will contradict each other, if you will. So,
It amazes me that David had the, I don't know the word, patience or the all opportunities. I mean, they're living in a time where call it barbaric, or watch follow God's will, kill, and he had so many chances to kill, but he knew better. Far as Saul.
yep.
And he dealt it. In fact, when Saul was dead, obviously he killed the guy that killed him. He got all kinds of chances. It's pretty amazing.
And gaining territory the whole time for Saul too, right? Again, I mean, he's giving everything to Saul. I mean, he's killing army after army, gathering land for Saul this whole time. Most people in that scenario eventually would trump their boss and want to become the boss.
That wasn't Saul the father of his best friend, too?
He was, Jonathan, yes ma'am. Yep. Him and Jonathan had a very, very strong love, actually. Jonathan actually helped preserve David in one scenario.
That was the deal about the arrows being shot in the air between Jonathan and
David?
yeah.
Yep.
And that was the signal not to come to the meal or something.
Yep, you're correct, yep.
Do you know if the Jews are still keeping lineage from David?
They are, yeah, they're still waiting for that, so, yep.
Well, I mean, do they know who the descendants are?
They do, yeah, there's rich claim to that, so yeah, if you're of the Davidic line, you are prominent in that.
I got this little map, and it says Holy Land, divided kingdom, around 900 BC, would this be about the same? It's got the northern kingdom listed here, and the southern kingdom, Judah. So Israel was the northern, and Judah was the southern, is that right?
Okay, yep, that should be right, yeah, just let's check me, cool, yep. And obviously that's where Jude comes from, is the tribe of Judah again, right, just for understanding there. The other tribes, well, 10 of them ceased, right? God did away with that as well, and two persisted into modern day. I think we just looked at that, didn't we? Yeah, we did. I didn't know how far that'd get us today, but again, I'd like to dive into actually some of the actions of David for the next lesson I've got there. But interesting facts, again, kind of from today, is that we don't know who David's mother is. for being such a prominent figure. Jesse's called out, and we've got some all right details there. He was a farmer, had sheep that David took care of. And then, yeah, out of all of his sons, Jesse was about 100 when he had David. Again, so some significance to that birth, both on the father, mother side. And then being the youngest, you know, there was intention, I guess, on God's side there of his upbringing, helping him to be ready for stepping into the kingship. David came into Saul's life very early, so we've seen him anointed there. When Saul was a king, he started to be disturbed. Again, he was losing favor with God. God was sending him some delusions, so David actually initially come in to play the harp for him. And so David won the heart of Saul over his harp skills and being able to quench some of the turmoil he had, you know, for a few minutes at a time, it sounded like. So again, when you read the story, it gets kind of different because David seems to be this intimate person for Saul to give him some relief during this time. And then when David grows up to be older and coming to take on David or Goliath, Saul didn't recollect that this was the same individual playing for him. So it was kind of interesting there. But again, and then obviously David becomes the leader of Saul's army, and then, you know, goes ahead and expands the Israelite territory for Saul and God, and then steps into the kingship of that. So with that being said, any other? Yes, ma'am.
So you said he had 8 wives. Is that common back then?
It was very common, yeah, and it could be for many reasons. Sarah, he actually had many more if you read. So depending on how you want to take it, he had, they say, upwards of 300 concubines as well. So that term could be his wife as well. So it was very common back then, and nothing against it. You know, we do see early on in Genesis, right, you'll read that God has made man and woman, you know, to become one flesh, you know, so that becomes a point of contention when you look at David, Solomon, even more wives. So. They don't practice that today in Judaism, but yeah. And we'll look at Bathsheba, you know, to that point. It's interesting that, you know, Solomon, or the line continues from Bathsheba, given the circumstances there.
God frowned on that during that day?
Pardon me?
You think God frowned on that practice?
I don't. I think, again, and the reason I would say that, Greg, is we see different stories of how the world was populated and how it went about. Societies were governed very differently back then, you know, and the way that it went. So depending on how it was, marriage was a very sacred thing as well, right? It wasn't David, you know, understood. You know, there was a different thing in the society about it and the way that governance went and understanding. So was it for all men? I don't believe it was, but for certain men, you know, obviously it was utilized, so. And there were scenarios, again, like Boaz marrying, right? Some of his wives could have been inherited, you know, just captives, right? I go in and I take siege. I'm going to take that king's wives as my prize, and they become my wives now. And that was an understanding from God. You know, you go and take siege, take the women. So.
He let people in the beginning live to be hundreds and hundreds of years old to populate the earth.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not given all the details, but there's an understanding that we went from Adam and Eve into, you know, a fully populated creation here for sure. So
I read it a minute ago where the oldest man to father a child was Lamech at 188. And I think it was so I just traveled in far from the tree too. But there's somebody else who probably living in the 60s, I think.
Noah made it very long. I think he almost made 1,000.
Noah, he's probably.
Yeah, it would have been Noah probably who you're talking about.
Father Noah. There you go.
So, yeah. I mean, the history is very, very interesting. It's a lot different, right? It's, you know, you definitely don't want to try to translate it in today's society. I try to go the opposite way with it and understand the way that it was back then, but. right, well, shut that out.